frankly, mainly political window dressing, not really implemented or monitored. Not so in Ukraine. For the NACP, the development of the anti-corruption strategy, with about 1,000 or more anti-corruption measures across 15 priority areas, that is just where they begin to prevent corruption. They really get to work with the state anti-corruption program to coordinate the implementation. They have a dedicated information system to monitor and to communicate. They do it all in close collaboration with civil society, international partners. So, Victor, thank you for being here. Please, if you would tell us about that process of how the NACP goes from an anti-corruption strategy to a program and an information system to monitor and to communicate. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Distinguished guests, distinguished speakers. I'll try to shortly describe the anti-corruption strategy and state corruption program of Ukraine, because we need more time to fully understand the role of them for Ukraine. First of all, current anti-corruption strategy for 2021-2025 is a comprehensive document that defines 73 problems that must be solved by the end of year 2025. And its implementation takes place through the implementation of a number. You mentioned more than 1,000. It's more than 1,100 measures to be implemented according to the state anti-corruption program dated years 2023, 2025. The program and strategy are aimed at increasing the effectiveness of the system of preventing and countering corruption, prevention of corruption in the areas most affected by corruption, and ensuring the inevitability of responsibility for corruption. As of the end of the third quarter of year 2024, state authorities, the executors of the state program, fully or partially implemented 402 measures, which is almost 34% of the total number. I'll try to mention some of the results of the key achievements of the implementation of the program. For example, the restoration of mandatory e-declaration and the function of NACP to control asset declarations, resumption of reporting of political parties and the function of NACP to control them, strengthening and the institutional capacity of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office. Introduction of a single personal trial of criminal proceedings in the High Anti-Corruption Court. Introduction of the legal regulation of lobbying, for example. Of course, we have some challenges that we need to implement in future. In particular, in terms of further implementation of the strategy and program, I try to name some of them. For example, increasing the institutional capacity of NABU, SAPO, and High Anti-Corruption Court in future. Strengthening the institutional capacity of Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office by legislatively empowering its head to carry out independently, for example, sending requests for the extradition of offenders and the creation of joint investigation teams to the competent authorities of foreign countries, entering information about the criminal offense into the state register of deputies, and starting a pretrial investigation against members of parliament. Approval of the request to conduct investigation, including clandestine and other procedural action against members of parliament. Minimizing of the abuse of procedural rights. For example, we've developed the exact law that gives us a draft of law that gives us ability to reduce the time for hearing cases in High Anti-Corruption Court, because now we have the average time of hearing case from registration in a law enforcement agency till the verdict of High Anti-Corruption Court. 7 years. It's really a long time for people's will for having the result nowadays. And many other issues that need to be implemented in future. I believe that all implementers among of the state anti-corruption program, it's more than 100 state agencies involved in this process, will help us in future to implement those measures and to achieve significant results. These results are our way to in our negotiation procedure to European Union. And in future, I think Clemens can say the same words. And now we are deeply involved in the negotiation procedure through the implementation of those measures and the process of anti-corruption mainstreaming that gives us ability to find corruption risks and to make measures to eliminate them in future, and also to develop new anti-corruption strategy and state anti-corruption program for years 2026 till 2030. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Victor. Really appreciate that, hearing that description of all the important strands of work that you all have going on at the NACP. Let's turn from Ukraine's top anti-corruption official to a perspective from Ukraine's uniquely vibrant civil society. I mean, look, in most countries, nonprofit researchers, advocates, activists are often, we are viewed as, wonks, do-gooders advancing narrow or elite interests. In Ukraine, civil society has earned broad legitimacy as the beating heart of the civic nation. I mean, whereas civil societies elsewhere focus mostly on the watchdog role of monitoring governance, Ukrainian civil society specialists do things that governments, private sectors, other actors do as well in other countries. Draft the most important laws, advocate for their passage, collaborate with the government to actually implement policy initiatives, develop the tools that are used for that, fire off signal flares to the Ukrainian public or diplomatic circles or others when reforms go off the rails. So let's hear a bit about that from a leading figure of Ukrainian civil society, an expert on asset recovery and anti-money laundering. Tetiana Shevchuk is legal counsel at the Anti-Corruption Action Center, ANTAC. So if you would, for us, please, Tetiana, if you could describe that active role of civil society through the life cycle of reform by describing perhaps the process in the context of one of the biggest reforms of 2024, the reboot of the Bureau of Economic Security. That would be very helpful. Tetiana, thanks for being here. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Josh. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to hear that Ukrainian civil society has some specific unique role, but probably it's not because we are so unique. That's because we are in a very unique situation, especially now in the situation of full-scale war. We are here having the task helping state to fight, and we see the fighting corruption is a very important measure, a step to help the state be more stable, and especially given the state of the economy, the idea that we need to have stronger economy, and that's why we need to fight corruption is very popular, I would say. That's how we came to the need to reform Economic Security Bureau. So just to explain that the Economic Security Bureau is the special law enforcement agency that was modeled to fight high-level tax fraud or white-collar crime, as we call it, economic crime here. And that's on the one hand protecting diligent businesses from the fraudsters, from the attempts of raiding and etc. And on the other hand, protect state economic interests. Unfortunately, these agents in Ukraine turned to be very corrupt, and instead of helping businesses, was an obstacle to, and unfortunately, still in some instances is an obstacle to doing diligent business. However, when we were starting the discussion a year ago, in October, for instance, last year, everyone said that it would be possible to do a good sort of reform right now. But by the end of the year, situation changed, and I'm grateful for the EU Commission, for the IMF jumping on board and supported it through their conditionalities. That's why it helped to advance the reform very, very quickly. So in summer, we already have adopted the necessary legislation, and that's how we work. So we started with the advocating for the idea that guys, we have a dire situation in the economy. Let's do something with watchdog over that. Let's do something with Economic Bureau, Security Bureau. We need to help our diligent business to survive and be stronger. And that was long, long for Ukraine, I would say. Half a year process of drafting legislation, finding the actors in the government, in the parliament supported this reform, then the adoption, and now we are in November in the implementation period already. The special commission that will be selecting new head of the bureau has already launched its work, and we hope that in spring we already will have in 2-3 months we already will have the new bureau head who will start the rectification, the launching of the entire bureau. That will help send the signal to the business. You are protected here in Ukraine, and of course ensure that the state receives all the necessary taxes, duties, etc. And we will keep this balance. What can I say about the role of civil society organizations? I just want to commend all stakeholders in the process, because we as a civil society organization, we were sharing our expertise that we've gathered already in the work with anti-corruption institutions. But there will also many others that they just think tanks who usually work just the think tanks. They come up supporting this idea. Business associations, their voices were very, very strong. They actually were the ones who were running this, that they said that we need this. And it sent a very strong signal both to international partners and our MPs that this law is supported by businesses, so we need it. This is an example actually of the teamwork that in Ukraine, when we work as a team, maybe when the civil society we take the lead or have strong voice usually just to or collect the ideas and voices of others, but only the team play help to fight corruption. And that's what I want to see more, because we have still a lot of things to do. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for everything that you are doing and still have to do, and that great description of it, Tatiana. We should actually pause here to say that folks should use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We do have 2 more speakers we're going to turn to just now, but then we'll have a Q&A session, and so you can start to log those questions, and then I will read them out after our final two speakers. So let's pivot from Kyiv to Brussels to another leading figure of Ukrainian civil society to focus on the international dimensions and future priorities. Olena Prokopenko is a senior fellow at GMF. She was instrumental to reforms developed following the Revolution of Dignity, having run international relations at Reanimation Package of Reforms, worked in senior advisor positions at the Rada and the Ministry of Finance, and then in recent years has been a leader of the Ukrainian diaspora in the EU, working for the UNDP, Council of Europe, Danish Embassy in Ukraine, most recently the European Endowment for Democracy. So, Elena, from your vantage point, would you please describe the international dimension of the work of Ukrainian civil society? And what do you think civil society should focus on next year in their outreach to Western audiences to help advance Ukraine's reform progress? The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Josh. I'd like to start by saying that given how incredibly difficult this year has been for Ukraine at the front lines and in terms of preserving itself as an independent state, I find it unthinkable that today we can actually discuss Ukraine's reform progress. But at the same time, we see that it's during these past 3 years of Russia's full-scale invasion that Ukraine has made some of the most significant advances in the key reform areas that Tatiana already outlined. Looking back at civil society's role in this process over the past decade, we can see that it has truly been a key driver of the reform progress since the Revolution of Dignity. civil society organizations were architects of Ukraine's new government institutions, particularly the anti-corruption sector. They drafted legislation in all the key reform areas. They participated in the selection of judges and other top officials, and frankly performed many other functions that are way beyond civil society's traditional mandate. But again, these achievements would not be possible if it wasn't for the close coordination, for the close consolidation of the civil society and international partners of Ukraine, particularly through the instrument of reform conditionalities tied to international assistance. These conditionalities, these reform benchmarks that we used to call miracle makers back in the day, they really help to speed up Ukraine's democratic progress exponentially. And from what we're hearing now from the reformers in the Ukrainian government and the parliament, conditionalities should be utilized even more actively by the international partners. After these 10 years, it's really encouraging to see that civil society is still a key guardian of Ukraine's reform achievements, despite multiple extra burdens that the war has placed on civic actors. And I mean from extreme lack of security to massive brain drain and so on. But it's also important to remember that the war has forced civil society to split its efforts, to split its attention between domestic reforms, including anti-corruption, and international advocacy of security guarantees, of recovery funding, and Ukraine's transatlantic integration. And given how the war is developing, given the war dynamics, this international advocacy component will probably need to remain key to the civil society's agenda in the years to come. It means that civil society would need to focus its lobbying efforts on the reform of Ukraine's defense sector, improving its governance, increasing its transparency and efficiency, and generally just streamlining Ukraine's defense cooperation with the Western allies. Civil society would also need to push for Ukraine's NATO membership, starting with the soonest NATO invitation for Ukraine that would launch Ukraine's negotiations to join NATO. Another priority would be to keep pushing for Western partners to authorize Ukraine to use their weapons to target military objects deep into the Russian territory, and Make Russia Pay campaign would also remain crucial in 2025. It would enable channeling Russian assets frozen in the West into Ukraine's recovery and would help address immense destruction that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine. Besides, given the speed at which EU accession negotiations are progressing, it will be critical for civil society to focus on supporting these efforts, and not only in Brussels, but also in the member states' capitals, where most resistance to Ukraine's integration is coming from, as we know. Several strong civil society organizations are already involved in supporting and monitoring the screening process, the screening of the fundamentals cluster that take place at the moment. And going forward, it will be key to advocate concrete reform conditionalities for this cluster so that Ukraine can demonstrate measurable results in this sphere, particularly, I mean, the rule of law and public administration segments. And speaking of public administration, I think it deserves special attention here, and it's really the most important area of reforms for the next decade, I would say. Preserving institutions and securing the balance of power in Ukraine is really critical to safeguarding democracy, especially given all the burdens of the martial law that we observe, all the burdens that have been put on the democratic processes. Besides, public administration reform is central to Ukraine's successful accession to the EU, as Ukrainian ministries need more comprehensive policy planning capabilities. They need more institutional independence. And I think it's safe to say that resuming the reform of public administration is the second most vital national priority after military support. That's why I would argue that it should remain among civil society's priorities next year and become a key part of programming for international donors in Ukraine. In other words, I would say that public administration reform should become the new anti-corruption for the donor community, because it's just as critical to Ukraine's democratic resilience. And we at GMF in Kiev and Brussels and Washington, D.C. and beyond are here to support civil society's work in these critical areas in every way that we can. Thank you, Josh, over to you.
Thank you very much. Elena, so lots there to unpack. We can probably come back in the in the Q&A session. But right now, let's go to our final speaker, another senior government official. Elena just mentioned the fundamentals cluster of the enlargement process as the most important cluster. So we are actually very lucky to get to go to the genius behind that cluster. The EU official responsible for designing governance reforms that are embedded into both the EU's Ukraine support facility, but then also the EU accession process, and particularly the fundamentals cluster. So we should all be thankful that EU leadership is utilizing Clemens Muller for this important mission, because he understands Ukrainian reform needs and processes as deeply as anyone at the Commission, in my opinion, having long worked on these issues at EUACI, the EU Advisory Mission, and elsewhere. So Clemens, um, how will continued reform progress in Ukraine be anchored to the enlargement process? And how will balance of power and governance considerations like the public administration reforms that Elena was just referring to be incorporated into the fundamentals cluster as part of the accession process? The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Josh and colleagues, and also from Brussels, happy Anti-Corruption Day. The good thing is that every day in Ukraine is Anti-Corruption Day. So in that sense, nothing special, but still good to recall indeed all the measures, the anti-corruption measures that were taken throughout the decade of transformation you have rightfully then labeled. And also our ambassador, our EU ambassador to Ukraine, has just published an op-ed in Kyiv Independent, outlining also milestones of the reform in the area of anti-corruption and beyond during the last 10 years. Now, on your question, and apologies already that digging into the Commission processes on enlargement is heavy on process sometimes, but I'm trying to be very brief where we currently stand. After Ukraine filed for membership application 4 days into the full-scale invasion, the candidate country status was granted the same year, in addition to with the sort of additional 7 reform steps Ukraine had to take. It was not conditional, but expected, and Ukraine delivered on those. Out of those 7, 5 were in the area of rule of law and anti-corruption. More broadly, then in December 2023, the Council decided to open the accession negotiations with Ukraine, and a historical decision. And then throughout 2024, we have held several bilateral meetings and explanatory meetings of the so-called screening process with the Ukrainian counterparts. Particular also on the fundamental cluster, we have now accomplished the screening meetings by November this year, and we are now in the process of drafting the screening report. And the screening report will basically detail where Ukraine currently stands and the overall alignment with the EU acquis, the set of rules and regulations the EU has in place, as well as standards and practices of the EU. So this screening report will then translate into recommendations, and Ukraine, the Council will invite Ukraine to submit the so-called opening benchmarks, which are in the case of Ukraine, and that is stipulated in the negotiating framework that was put in place for the enlargement process with Ukraine. 2 roadmaps, the rule of law roadmap and the public administration roadmap. And so you see those 2 issues, public administration reform and rule of law more broadly, are really sort of the centerpiece of the enlargement process. So those roadmaps, they will be assessed by the European Commission, and then we will draw up an opening benchmark assessment report, and it will again go to the Council, and then again with the decision of unanimity, the Council can decide to invite Ukraine to submit its negotiation position. And then also the EU will define its EU common position. And if all that done, then that will be an intergovernmental meeting where we will then potentially open to decide the cluster negotiations with Ukraine on the fundamental cluster. Cluster 1, which is with Chapter 23 and Chapter 24 at the heart of the enlargement process. So this is quite an ambitious endeavor, obviously, particularly that Ukraine is pursuing this during wartime. But we will do everything on the Commission side to facilitate and assess this as soon as possible. The current time frame for this is we expect that the screening report will be sent to the Council in January, and then we hope that the rule of law roadmap and the public administration roadmap as the benchmarks will be sent shortly thereafter to the Commission, and then with the assessment to the Council, and hopefully we will manage together with Ukraine to open the cluster negotiations still during the Polish presidency of the first half of 2025. So this is in terms of process besides the rule of law roadmap and the public administration roadmap, public administration reform roadmap. There will be also the need for a roadmap on functioning of democratic institutions. That is not an opening benchmark. And there will be also need for an action plan in terms of minorities. Again, that is also not an open benchmark according to the negotiating framework. Now, maybe quickly looking a little bit into substance. So what we will assess in the screening report of Cluster 1. So as I mentioned earlier, it will be the public administration reform, but it will be also the functioning democratic institutions, which concerns parliament, the work of civil society, elements like political party funding. Then there will be rule of law more broadly, which includes the judiciary, prosecution, the anti-corruption institutions, but also the law enforcement agencies, meaning police, State Bureau of Investigation, also asset recovery, anti-money laundering, and procurement among the most prominent items in the fundamental cluster. Now, speaking briefly in terms of anti-corruption, and without now being able to present what will be in detail in the screening report, but you will find, I think, 3 bigger pillars that are assessed there. First is the strategic and legal framework, a policy framework, strategic policy framework, and legal framework. And Victor from NASICA has already mentioned the anti-corruption strategy and anti-corruption program in place. So this is exactly what the Commission will look into, the quality, the implementation rate, and we will formulate a set of recommendations in that regard. Then also the second pillar will be the institutional framework. We will look in more detail in the establishment of the anti-corruption institutions, from NABU to the preventive agency to the High Anti-Corruption Court. Also, what kind of tools they have available, from the asset declaration system already mentioned, but also to possibly more sectoral reforms that already took place and will have to take place, including also some elements on anti-corruption mainstreaming in this regard. And it both goes for the central as well as for the local levels. And then one element that is always quite prominently that features as well in our enlargement report that we're publishing now annually, the last report is from October this year, is the track record, meaning how are the institutions on the repression side, meaning NABU, SAPO, the Anti-Corruption Court, as well as the preventive side, how are they delivering in terms of their outcomes and their outputs? What is the track record? What are the achievements? So this is also something where the Commission has quite some focus on attention on. So Those are, I would say, currently where we stand in terms of process, what you can expect in substance. Of course, utilizing conditionalities is at the center of the accession process. We call this benchmarks, not conditionalities. The conditionality language is more as part of our macro-financial assistance programs that the Commission has also in place as part of the Ukraine facility. But nonetheless, the benchmarks, the opening benchmarks will be the first step. There will be interim benchmarks and closing benchmarks as part of the ongoing negotiations in the respective clusters then. And those will be very likely drawn from the roadmaps. That's why the roadmaps are really important instruments as part of the accession process. So you see, the decade of transformation is continuing in full speed despite wartime. And I think again, Ukraine has made really great progress over the last years, particularly over the last decade. And this is really a great achievement. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Clemens, for unpacking all the many parts in that process, to those who of us who do not closely follow the enlargement process, it may sound like a lot of process, many steps. I would say I have learned from you that is a good thing, that there are, it sounds like, these roadmaps, screening report, all of these benchmarks, the conditionality, as you've taught us, can help kickstart reforms. But to really keep the momentum going, you need to be able to come back with all of these other parts of the process and make it continue over a period of time. And that's how we're going to really anchor the next decade. So kudos to the work that you are doing. Having gotten through our prepared remarks, let's go to the Q&A. Folks should continue to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. As a first one, if we still have Victor here, because I know he was being generous with his time and had to run, but if you're still here, Victor, I guess having just heard from Clemens as well about the EU accession process as a driver of continued anti-corruption reform progress, can you talk about how the NACP's work is integrated into the development of Ukraine's EU roadmap and screening report and other parts of the larger process?
Yes, thank you so much. I'll try to briefly describe. Clemens already mentioned that we were involved in the process of in negotiation procedure of cluster fundamentals. Of course, we are involved in all other clusters and chapters among 36 chapters of negotiation procedure through the process of anti-corruption mainstreaming. Now we are deeply involved in the process of developing groups for our corruption risk assessments. For those procedures, with the help of our partners like Pro-Integrity and European Union Anti-Corruption Initiative, we are planning to do our best to have results that can be used according to the those strategies that we discussed with the European Commission. And also we are involved in the process of developing a roadmap on the chapter 23, where we have our issue, anti-corruption issue. It was also mentioned by Clemens that during the procedure of screening, we had meeting on those issues. We showed the results of Ukraine, and we could present all results for last 5 years of anti-corruption institutions like NAB, SAP, and NACP, using also track record and all legal framework and our level of implementation of documents according to the European Union acquis. I think it's mainly main our functions, and now we are trying, as I already mentioned in my speech, trying to combine those tasks of anti-corruption mainstreaming with our procedure of developing new anti-corruption strategy and state anti-corruption program for years 2026 and 2030.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Victor, for all of that and for being with us. I know that you are running into another meeting, so I appreciate being able to get to you with a question as well. Thanks for being with us. We have another question related to what Olena said was the second most vital national priority after military assistance, which, here we are on Anti-Corruption Day. You might think anti-corruption, but she was specifically talking about public administration reform, which sounds like a bit of a technocratic backwater, but I think she is totally right that upholding the constitutional balance of power is going to be just as important over the next decade as anti-corruption per se has been over the past decade, and it really feeds into anti-corruption. So we're talking about real institutional power sharing so that it's not, just one part of the government, like the office of the president, where power is so concentrated that they're actually the ones curating, ministers that are acting as figureheads or sort of dictating to the parliament what exactly they have to do. So the question is how that will fit in to, well, I guess I'd like to hear more about that from either Olena or Tatiana, and then we'll go to Clemens as well, because I was curious kind of how that set of reforms fits into the accession process, because I could see it being relevant to all three of those roadmaps: rule of law, public administration, of course, and democratic institutions, because those are democratic constitutional institutions. So curious how that fits in. But maybe first on the issue, Olena, anything else you wanna share with us about public administration reform?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. As I said, public administration was put on hold arguably back in 2019, not even with the start of the full-scale invasion. And it is critical to unblock that reform and to make public administration conditionalities a cross-cutting, not conditionalities, benchmarks, cross-cutting benchmarks throughout the fundamentals cluster. And I would probably say that throughout the whole negotiation process, including in other clusters, because for Ukraine to make sufficient progress with the accession, it's key for the ministries, for other government agencies to have comprehensive policy planning capabilities, to have respective departments that would be responsible for the accession process, and they need to have stronger institutional independence, political independence, and this is not exactly there at the moment. So I would also be interested to hear from Clemens and from Tatiana how they see this on the practical level, how this can be fed into the accession process dynamics.
Great, thanks. Clemens or Tatiana, thoughts on public administration reforms?
Yeah, thank you, colleagues. Indeed, so public administration reform, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine will have to submit a roadmap on further public administration reforms elements. A draft has been already shared with the Commission for consultations in this regard, and we are in bilateral discussions with the authorities in this regard. The same is also true for the rule of law roadmap. And I know that also according to the negotiating framework, consultation with civil society and other stakeholders will be required when those roadmaps are designed. Now, if I'm not mistaken, we have in the Ukraine facility plan, I think 4 or 5 conditionalities that relate to power. So that will be in addition to the enlargement process. That will all be very complementary. Now, also, so what we will look into there more broadly is that Ukraine is capable in making evidence-based policy making. That's the particular big item. But then also issues like the salary reform, the recruitment selection of civil servants. So those are the elements. And in the past, there was also already the adoption of the code on administrative procedures. That is also something obviously that needs to be properly applied in practice. So those are really key elements of the public administration reform. The Commission is supporting Ukraine with technical assistance on the ground. We have a dedicated flagship project, EU for Power, that is assisting the authorities with advisory services and beyond to achieve those reforms. So it's really one of the key elements of the fundamental cluster, the public administration reform. Thank you.
Tatiana.
Yeah, probably I will add on the political aspect of that because everyone agrees that the public administration reform is important, but it's a less popular politically. It's always on the end of the list of the priorities of the government. Therefore, probably we had such a long traction of doing these reforms of implementation. Also, we've been talking this for 10 years already. Probably because it always arises the issue of salaries of the public officials, which very unpopular decision. Also, if you look into the real salaries, they are actually low, but nobody from the political side really wants to raise these expenses or talk about these expenses, although they are necessary even in the anti-corruption dimension. But in Ukraine now has other unique challenge for public administration reform right now is the lack of human capital. We already feel it through many competitions in the judiciary, in the public offices, that we lack people applying for the job. And that would be another big challenge once we implement all the necessary, good, perfect regulations. There would be an issue of finding people to go to the state and doing the job. It's very important thing for European integration process because European integration is a huge project. It requires a lot of hands on deck doing the job. And there is a question where to find those professionals and how to attract them to work within the government, or even with the civil society sector supporting the government. It's a challenge. So we are looking for the roadmaps and looking for the implementation because it would be a huge challenge for us.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you all are focused on it. We have a question about please describe the important role of international conditionality. I imagine this has come up because we've now heard about it a few times. Clemens was talking about conditionalities under the EU-Ukraine support facility. Elena called conditionality miracle makers. Yeah, I too am excited to hear how the panelists would describe whether they're miracle makers, whether they, as Clemens would say, just kickstart the reforms. I myself have faced this question, had to describe it, including very recently advising a Western military official to make aid conditional on reforms to the Ministry of Defense's Defense Procurement Agency, the DPA, to try to, make it impossible for the defense minister to fire the CEO of the DPA without concurrence of the supervisory board. And when I told this official that RADA makers are interested in this, they tell me they could do it very, very quickly if there was conditionality. The response from the official was, okay, well then why don't they just do it? And so then I had to give him a lecture about how much it helps reformers, even when they're at the highest levels of government and parliament, when they can point to billions of dollars of aid that Ukraine will not get unless it delivers reforms, and in a political system where you still have lots of points of leverage that private and concentrated political interests, have with lawmakers and bureaucrats and judges, even a reformist government is going to need that outside pressure to help push through key reforms. But anyway, I'd rather hear from the experts that we have here how you would describe the role of conditionality. Just jump ball to anyone who wants to talk about that. Elena.
I can say a few words on that. Yes, when was it? Last week we hosted here at GMF in Brussels several distinguished Ukrainian members of parliament, and all of them were unanimous in saying that any requirement, any benchmark of the West that is, any reform benchmark that is included in the international assistance to Ukraine of any kind gets priority on the agenda of the Ukrainian parliament and the government. And yes, I also made that remark, Josh, saying that Ukrainian government and parliament should be interested in implementing reforms without the benchmarks, without the conditionalities being a necessity here. But the truth is that Ukraine is at war. Ukraine is grappling multiple major challenges, and there are countless things on the agenda. And the way to make reform steps a priority and to bring them as high on the agenda as possible, it's key to tie them to the international assistance and to tie them to Ukraine's progress on the transatlantic path, because this is the vector that Ukrainian government recognizes as key, and Ukrainian parliament does everything to keep those things high on the agenda. So if we want to see specific reform steps implemented as soon as possible, they need to become a part of benchmarks, part of conditionality for microfinancial assistance and Ukraine's EU accession, NATO accession.
I agree with Olena that conditionalities is actually about priorities. I think that Ukraine is capable of doing the necessary reforms without these conditionalities. We have examples in recent 2 years. For instance, 2 major anti-corruption measures were adopted without any conditionalities from the partners. This is opening the non-lethal procurements for the military, putting them to the PROZORO system, which evidently decreased corruption and then decreased prices for the Ministry of Defense. And this September, the Parliament also adopted the law opening cost estimates, the prices for the infrastructure construction works within the PROZORO system, which is also a huge reform and anti-corruption measure, which was not demanded by any donors. So it is possible to do such reforms, but these conditionalities, they give push, they give priorities, and they give framework. The other example I would make is opening the asset declarations of public officials. The conditionalities from the donors were just to restore the asset declaration. But that put the issue into agenda, and then Ukrainian public demanded to do it public on website available for everyone, and it worked in synergy. So I think this is in the situation when we don't have elections, we don't have real competitive political process, when the opposition could push the government, or when government can do something populistic a bit in anti-corruption closer to elections, as we used to have in 2018, 2019. In this situation, those conditionalities give necessary political push that help the reformers, help the agents of change within the government, within the parliament, to set the agenda.
Great. Well, thanks, Tatiana. Clemens, thoughts on conditionality?
Yes, thank you, Josh and colleagues. Maybe a couple of reflections. I think first it's important to stress that the conditionalities that the EU has on both policy tracks, meaning the Ukraine facility and the Ukraine plan, where those conditionalities are stipulated, but as well as in the enlargement track, meaning opening benchmarks, as I mentioned earlier, or the 7 steps and that were linked to the candidate country status. Except for the 7 steps, those were all reached with agreement of Ukraine. Meaning there's a memorandum of understanding for the macro financial assistance program, and now also in relation to the new framework on the loans as part of the 50 billion US dollar package. So those are all those conditionalities, as you might want to call them. They're all done with the agreement of the Ukrainian government as part of negotiations. So there's nothing that unilaterally comes from the Commission. I think this is important to stress. So it gives the ownership to the Ukrainian side in pursuing those reforms, because that is what they have agreed and committed to as part of these policy tracks. So the same is true for the rule of law roadmap. This is a document, or for the other roadmaps, it's documents owned by Ukraine. Of course, we will assess them and we will discuss them as well to make sure they are relevant and ambitious enough. Because eventually the enlargement process is a transformative process, and it will be only successful if it is a transformative. So that's the first observation. It's really sort of done in agreement. Second, as you already mentioned, indeed, I'm always often saying that conditionalities can only kickstart larger reforms. But it's more difficult to sustain them. So what I mean here, and you mentioned already the example of the asset declaration system, the launch of the asset declaration system was a conditionality as part of the visa liberalization roadmap that was put in place with Ukraine to grant visa-free travel for Ukrainian citizens. And as part of that, one of the last conditions that Ukraine needed to fulfill was the launch of the asset declaration system. So the asset declaration system was launched in 2016. And then throughout the years, yes, it is a success, but it came also with a lot of ups and downs. The suspension of the system, the restoration of the system, but not the full restoration system as the system was before. So there was a lot of back and forth. Additional conditionalities had to come into play. Petition of Ukrainians had to be made to the president to make the asset declarations public again as part of the relaunch. So that's on the broad administration of the system. If you look at the actual outputs, for example, it's also meant to detect cases of illicit enrichment. Here again, the Constitutional Court decided, I think it was in 2018 or 19, that the criminal offense of illicit enrichment is unconstitutional, so it had to be reintroduced. But those cases that were pending, obviously, they needed to be halted because of the retroactive principle, and so on. So by now, as of now, there are not so many cases on illicit enrichment, and even less final convictions. So if you see it from the outcome side, again, my argument is it's fairly difficult to sustain those reforms with conditionalities, but you need sort of an underlying policy framework, which exactly the enlargement process and the enlargement track will bring into play. That can safeguard and ensure the sustainability of these reforms over time. So those are some reflections in terms of conditionality, which is indeed a very complex topic. And I guess one can have a 2 hours panel discussion just on conditionality and whether they work or they don't work. But also here, one thing is clear: Ukraine has 100% success rate on conditionalities, meaning 100% they delivered, at least on the conditionalities I can recall. Maybe there was one exception, but the same, I think, is also true for the IMF. So there might be some smaller delays, but overall, Ukraine has always delivered on the promises made as part of the conditionality memorandums. Thank you.
Well, thank you all three for distilling a complicated issue set there. Having a minute and a half left, why don't we just do last lightning round, starting with Tatiana and then Elena and Clemens. Any other thoughts, any last words that you have? 30 seconds each on your key point on International Anti-Corruption Day. Tatiana?
Sorry. We celebrate today that a lot has been done by Ukraine in 10 years, but there's still a lot to be done. And we are probably in very challenging implementation phase when we've set all the necessary institutions and basic legislation. And now we have to make it work and deliver the results. And that's the huge challenge, how we keep focus on that and how we keep delivering good results, protecting what we have, but reaching more and more good results.
Thanks. Elena?
Yes, I'd like to reiterate that civil society should be fully embedded in all the processes around Ukraine's further reform progress, EU accession progress, and governance reforms. And this will require full support from international partners, both politically, financially, and all the burdens that we have listed that the war has put on civil society have not made it easier for civic actors to be a central part of this process. And also we see that not all the government actors are open to this participation, to this cooperation with civic actors. So it's really critical that international partners stand behind civil society fully and support its role that's very critical in all of these ambitious processes.
And Clemens.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one important aspect is also to move beyond the anti-corruption institutions. Both the preventive agency and also NABU and SAPO, they have a very important role. And I think they have also strongly proven their significance over the last years since they were established. But by moving beyond, I mean, to look more into the sectors, the most relevant and vulnerable sectors, whether it's defense, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy, and really see there the reforms that quite often trigger anti-corruption as sort of a byproduct, to more radically really try to inject specific anti-corruption measures that would actually prevent corruption from occurring, and close the loopholes for preventive practices. I think this is really where additional focus needs to be done. Where an additional focus needs to be. So more corruption mainstreaming in relevant sectors, also corruption risk assessments in relevant sectors. And here NASICA, I think, has also a key role to play, but it's also for particular also for sector experts to really look also what can be more done in terms of anti-corruption. Thank you.
So we will look for mainstreaming and a role for civil society and everything that our distinguished speakers recommended and shared. Thank you for joining us from Kyiv and from Brussels. And thanks to all of the champions of Ukrainian anti-corruption whose steadfast efforts have really made the past decade of progress possible and will remain vital in the decade ahead. Thanks again. Slava Ukraini. All the best.